Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 23rd of February, where we are putting some closure onto Midsummer Night's Dream. And you can note in our notes below that your second journal, which is going to be on Midsummer Night's Dream, will be due on the 28th. That's this upcoming Monday, 11:59 p.m. via PDF to my email, much like you did with the first journal, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu. And as you know, I grade the journals informally. I'll put some comments on them as if we were having a conversation on paper, and then I will return them to your email. And my hope is that that might perhaps give you some direction with some more formal assignments, because eventually we will have our first paper due. That's not going to be due for a while. That won't be due for another month or so. That will be March 30th, and that is a Wednesday. Though certainly you are always encouraged to hand in any and all assignments early if you so elect. But by that point, we would have finished reading all of the comedies that I have assigned in our comedy unit. And then we will also have had a chance to talk about writing formal papers. So while we move forward to talk about histories and then eventually tragedies, that'll be the point in the semester in which you will be submitting in your first paper. And all of you have the option of revising that first paper for a higher grade. So once I return that to you, and that'll be graded on a formal letter scale, with my comments on not just your content, but grammar and mechanics. You can elect to earn a higher grade if you so choose by doing a revision and incorporating my comments into your revision. And I ask that you submit in the original paper with my comments along with your revision, and so I can compare the two. And then you would get the higher of the two grades. And you have until the ending of the semester to do that, but certainly the earlier the better for everybody involved. Now, the second paper is going to be due at the very ending of the semester, so you wouldn't necessarily have time to revise it. That said, if you are able to submit in your paper early enough, there is the possibility for revision, but we would have to negotiate that. But everybody has the option of revising paper number one. But first, let me talk about A Midsummer Night's Dream now that we've watched performance, and I've talked in each of the performances that we've seen a little bit about some of the themes and issues in the play. The significance of the title, now that we've watched the play and read the play, I assume, in its entirety, Midsummer is not necessarily the middle of the summer, but it happens to be the longest day of the year. And when we talk about the longest day of the year on usually June 21st or thereabouts, there are lots of pagan associations with that particular day. It also is linked with May Day because Shakespeare mentions May Day which is May 1st, in the play itself. And May Day is also a day that has pagan associations with it. So if you are familiar with dancing around the maypole, and I may have mentioned this in a previous class, that the maypole is a phallic symbol that was used to celebrate renewal and rebirth and fertility. Both Midsummer and May Day were days that were associated with fertility and rebirth and renewal, and the way that it was celebrated was often very sexual in nature, which gets to the idea of Shakespeare's bawdiness. That said, I think we'll see a little bit more of the bawdiness when I start talking about some of the specific language. And as we had discussed, it was a time period that wasn't shy when it came to sex or violence, but politics, that needed to be done with a little bit more care because a political mishap could lead to honestly death if one were to anger the wrong political entity. So Shakespeare had to be very careful with his political commentary. He did make political commentary, as we saw in the sonnets. He just had to be careful about it. So Midsummer is a day that's already associated with sexuality and fertility, and yet the idea was that virginity, especially for female, was paramount before marriage, and that if a woman did not have her virginity before marriage, she was seen as damaged goods, in effect. So there's that interesting dichotomy and contrast between the two. The idea that this is happening at night, and obviously the night is associated with things that are erotic and sexual, but also it's under the guise of darkness. And there's a lot of light and dark in this play, and it's a theme that we oftentimes see in Shakespeare, especially when we start reading a play like Othello. But mixed in with this comedy, there's a good amount of darkness associated with it. It often strikes me just how dark Oberon is. Again, depending on the actor and the interpretation, Oberon can be portrayed very dark indeed. But certainly the way that he goes about humiliating Titania, and the way that he ultimately revels in the idea that he is successful in his power play, it's something that would seem to be out of place in a comedy. When we read our next comedy, Much Ado About Nothing, we're going to get an even stronger, quote, darker character. May I even suggest in the realm of villainy when we talk about a Don John. And in some ways, Don John has been seen as a kind of pre-Iago figure, if you're familiar with Othello. But we'll talk about all of that later. The idea of a dream, that of course there is this fantasy element associated with it, so that we could, if we wanted to, disregard all of the events. But do note that at the time of the Renaissance, there would have been a true belief in things like fairies and witches. So we were supposed to embrace them literally as well. And it's also a thematic statement about love. And we know that this play is about the difficulties and the conflicts associated with love. And we see with all of the love couplings and recouplings that no one is immune. That regardless of age, regardless of gender, regardless of social station, that ultimately everyone can be reduced when it comes to a situation associated with love. And I think that this idea that love is like a dream, it's something that is fantasy like. It can be marvelous, but it can also be nightmarish. It's something that cannot be controlled. And even the language that we use associated with love, for instance, we fall in love, and all of the negative connotations and associations with the word fall, again, something that is beyond our control, something that can hurt or can even kill in some instances. And one could say that we can make comparable parallels with love itself. Love is magical. It's one of the reasons why we've got so much magic in this play. Again, when we are loved, it's almost as if we are under a magic spell, and we're not able to control our actions, and we're not able to see the truth in front of us. Love can also be quite tragic, especially when we're looking at requited versus unrequited love. Notice how Shakespeare oftentimes gives us the two contrasts or the two sides of things. That love can be exhilarating, but yet it can also be humiliating. And we see both of that, especially with a character like Helena, who could be considered to be a strong female because ultimately women were not made to woo. So, and she's taking the active role of pursuer, and at the ending of the play, she's successful. However, we can also say that although women were not made to woo, the idea that she wants to be treated as a dog, in effect, treat me and spurn me, as you will, shows a certain level of passivity and degradation. So Shakespeare shows all of the sides of love, at least he's equal opportunity in terms of mocking love and examining love. And basically that all of us, and this includes the audience, especially the audience, is subject to the same follies of love. It's one of the major messages that appear in Act 5, that all of the characters in the play have previously been absurd when it came to love, and now they're watching a play about love, and they are enjoying themselves watching Pyramus and Thisbe and the absurdity and the ridiculousness of it, and laughing at it, but never once considering that they themselves were equally absurd and ridiculous just prior. And if we expand that, basically the message is for us as audience, whether we are watching or reading the play, that if we are mocking these characters or amused by these characters, and we don't stop to consider our own actions when it comes to love, then we are as blind as the characters themselves are. And certainly, once you've got Titania who falls in love with an ass, there is commentary about love there. That love is so blind that you could fall in love with a literal and figurative ass, and that everyone around you tries to tell you that you're with an ass, but of course, you aren't able to see the truth until the magical love spell is removed, whether that be literal or figurative. City versus forest, I think, is also another way, or wilderness is an interesting way of viewing this play. The city represents the rules of law and civilization, and that's in direct contrast to the wilderness, which is the world of nature where things are wild and untamed. And of course, it works very nicely in terms of the possibilities of sexual union with these couples because they are in the forest in the dark by themselves on a day that's associated with sexual union. So, that said, of course, for a happy ending, we're supposed to have the idea of virginity, at least for female, prior to marriage. It's one of the reasons why I don't much care for the Kevin Kline adaptation of A Midsummer Night's Dream with Callista Flockhart, if you've ever seen it. I believe it came out in the 90s, because they basically are portraying the couples as if they are actively engaged in erotic relationships at the ending of the play, and that really doesn't keep to the intent of Shakespeare. They also dress the characters in more modern attire. They're dressed in Victorian attire, I guess, to illustrate the idea of how one should be conservative in matters of love. But I think it falls flat because the Victorian period was very repressed, and that's certainly not the case for the Renaissance. They even have characters riding around on bicycles, and again, that's artistic license in terms of modernizing plays, but I don't think it's necessarily that effective. But as I had asked you in your attendance question, we also saw an adaptation. It wasn't on film, it was in Shakespeare in the Park, where also liberties were taken. That's not to say that liberties also weren't taken with Shakespeare in the Globe, whether you've got a tap dancing bottom or you've got a few notes from We Will Rock You from Queen. So they basically, they try to modernize in ways that can connect with particular audiences. But the consensus seemed to be that it was the Shakespeare Globe production that ultimately was the favorite. It certainly is my favorite. I think there's something that's quite magical about being able to see a production in a theater, albeit a reproduction that would have been Shakespeare's theater at the time. Though, as many of you indicated as well, the idea of setting the play in a park, since so much of the play occurs in the wilderness, gives it a very naturalistic feel. And Shakespeare in the Park productions are very esteemed, though the production we saw was an older production from the 1980s. So that might also have made it seem a little bit less contemporary or a little bit less appealing when you were watching that and comparing it to the Shakespeare Globe production. Ultimately, it was an unfair question in some ways that I asked, because if you truly wanted to make a comparison between the two, then you would have to see both of those plays, probably in their entirety, but at the very least, you would need to see the same acts and the same scenes. That isn't what happened. As you know, with the Shakespeare Globe, we saw the first part of the play, and then with Shakespeare in the Park, we saw the second part of the play, mostly because of necessity and what I was able to find available on the internet. But it still gave you an idea of differences in performance. And we'll continue to talk about performance when we talk about Much Ado About Nothing, which in some ways is very similar to A Midsummer Night's Dream, because as a comedy, it's about love and all of the conflicts that can occur within love, but it's set in a more naturalistic setting. So the days of fairies and magic are gone. And as I indicated, there's a darkness to it. There is definitely a darkness to Midsummer when we see characters like Oberon, but there's more darkness when we get to Much Ado About Nothing, which could have easily turned into a tragedy. And in many ways, it anticipates not just Iago and Othello, but the play Othello as a whole. The play within a play and the fifth act is so important because not only does it show us, as I was saying, all of the absurdities associated with love, but it's supposed to make us think about ourselves and how we have engaged in the absurdities of love. And it's also a wonderful opportunity for Shakespeare to mock his competition. Shakespeare, if nothing else, was a business person, as I think we've established. And this is his way of showing the quality, or shall I say the lack of quality, of the work of his contemporaries at the time, the writers and the actors, that they would perform a play like Pyramus and Thisbe, which is absolutely absurd. It always reminds me of an elementary school production where things are taken oh so literally. And again, the idea is that if we wanted to spend our time and our money with Shakespeare's competition, that's what we would likely see, as opposed to something of the greatness and grandeur of Shakespeare. So he deliberately did that as a dig. But also, it's very comedic, and as many of you indicated, there's a good amount of physical comedy in the comedies that oftentimes is missed when you are just reading the play. So it's one of the reasons why I wanted you to see a performance as well. And all of the characters are interesting on one level or another, but I think that Puck in particular is interesting. Usually he's an actor favorite. Many actors say that that's the role that they want to play, the Puck character, because there's a possibility for interpretation with Puck. You can play Puck as a more innocent character that basically is following orders when told by Oberon that basically you should put the love juice on the man wearing the Athenian garb. That's what Puck does, and he makes just a simple error that he confuses Lysander and Demetrius. Or you can play Puck as much more deliberate, and that he's quite aware of whom he should be placing that love juice on when he's told to place the love juice on the eyes of the man wearing the Athenian garb. He knows it's supposed to be Demetrius, but he uses the opportunity to put it on Lysander, since either of those men satisfy the requirements, because Puck enjoys the idea of creating havoc and chaos. And he's a mischievous spirit. He's not supposed to be evil necessarily, but mischievous, so that he can't cause permanent or direct pain, but he can certainly cause humiliation and embarrassment and conflict and chaos. And that's exactly what ensues. And of course, the conflicts only increase when Puck decides to, on his own, for his own amusement, to turn Bottom into an ass, because why not? Bottom acts like an ass, so he may as well be a literal ass. And then it's just a happy coincidence that the ass, Bottom, is the first thing that Titania sees. Remember that Oberon had desired the love juice on Titania's eyes so that he could distract her, so that he could take the changeling boy. Another commentary on love, and that when we are in love, we tend to be completely focused on our love, and things that used to matter to us in the past no longer do. And that's exactly what we saw with Titania. So I had indicated just the idea of gender, female in particular, I think is quite interesting in this play, because we've got some strong female characters, such as a Hermia, who defies her father and ultimately at the ending of the play gets her way. But then we've got other characters like Titania, who defies her husband, and she doesn't get her way and she's humiliated. And then we've got characters like Hippolyta, who've been conquered in war, and the assumption is that the ending of the play ends happily, so there is some sort of an understanding between the two. And as I had indicated, the actors who play Oberon and Titania also play Theseus and Hippolyta in the Globe production, to sort of illustrate some of the parallels between those two couplings, that we've got a human king and queen, and then we've got a fairy king and queen, but both of them have difficulties associated with love. So don't expect, as I had indicated in our syllabus with some of the quotes I had ended with about Shakespeare, don't expect any easy answers with Shakespeare. So don't expect to have a nice, neat little paper written talking about the role of the strong female in Midsummer Night's Dream. It's complex, but I think it's much more accurate to the human condition, because humanity is complex. So we usually don't get clear-cut answers. And that, I think, is also a question in terms of comedy and Demetrius. Ultimately, Demetrius is in love with Helena, but because of the love juice. One could say that this is a reestablishment of order, since he had loved her prior to the play, so that this is quote, happy ending. But yet he has been controlled and manipulated to love. So again, I don't know how much of a happy ending that is, at least for Demetrius. So even Shakespeare's happy endings can be somewhat complicated. And I think it was nothing less than a stroke of brilliance to end the play with Puck, since Puck is responsible for so much of the machinations that go on. It's a very interesting relationship Puck has with Oberon. Oberon is supposed to be the master, and Puck is the servant, and yet it's Puck who basically is responsible for all the action, and I wonder if any of this could have happened without Puck's intervention. It almost reminds me of the situation that exists in many workplaces where a president could be perhaps not present, and the business functions quite well, but when the administrative assistant is not present, the business basically comes to a standstill. So the idea that the one that's considered to be lower in the hierarchy is the one that really is the one is responsible for creating the action, I think is something that we could see with Puck. In fact, he even has been likened to a kind of Shakespeare character who controls and manipulates the action in the stage. And then at the very ending, where we get Puck's apology, it's a backhanded apology at that. Through the guise of Puck, it's basically the actor who is apologizing. But through the guise of the actor, it's basically Shakespeare who's apologizing. But again, in typical Shakespeare fashion, it's a backhanded apology, which gets me to the second part of the notes for today, and that's about language. And I wanted to just highlight a few quotes within the play that I think illustrate some of what Shakespeare is known for in terms of his writing. The first is wit. Now, Shakespeare can be very witty. Much Ado About Nothing, the play that's coming up, has oftentimes been called one of Shakespeare's wittiest plays because of the banter that goes on between two characters, Beatrice and Benedick. They're not even supposed to be the central characters. Hero and Claudia are supposed to be the central characters, but really our interest is with Benedick and Beatrice. And there's some wonderful witty dialogue between them, which goes to show that they're equally matched intellectually, as we'll talk about. But even something like in Midsummer Night's Dream, Act 1, Scene 1, line 93 to 95. And notice how nice it is that I don't have to rely on a page number. So regardless of the edition that you happen to be using of Shakespeare, we can all go to Act 1, Scene 1, approximately line 93 to 95. And we can find that line, just a short line, but I think it's so illustrative of the wit of Shakespeare and his humor. Lysander is speaking, and he's talking to Demetrius and says, "You have her father's love, Demetrius. Let me have Hermia. You do marry him." So in other words, well, why don't you just go marry the father, because the father already loves you. Aegeus, that is. A very famous quote, also in Act 1, Scene 1, but this would be approximately line 134, and it might be a quote that you've heard of before. "The course of true love never did run smooth," and I think we definitely see that in the context of the play itself. As we know, Shakespeare oftentimes uses rhyme and uses poetry in his writing. The idea is that it's supposed to help forward plot, so it's not supposed to be something that it seems out of place or something that is forced. And we can see the example of that as compared to the example of what perhaps Shakespeare's contemporaries might be doing in also the first act. Act 1, Scene 1, line 202. And this is a piece of dialogue between Hermia and Helena. And just notice the rhythm of these lines as Hermia is speaking. And Hermia says, "Take comfort, he no more shall see my face. Lysander and myself will fly this place. Before the time I did Lysander see, seemed Athens as a paradise to me. Oh, then, what graces in my love do dwell, they yet turn to heaven unto a hell." I mean, the rhyme is very naturalistic and it helps to forward the plot. Now, think about that in contrast to Act 1, Scene 2. And this would be line, I believe, 31. And this is where ultimately Bottom is rehearsing the play within the play. And this is when he says, The raging rocks and shivering shocks shall break the locks of prison gates, and Five's car shall shine from far, and make and mar the foolish fates. Yes, it rhymes, but the rhymes are absurd and ridiculous. They're bad rhymes. And it has this kind of sing-song quality to it, almost like roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, so are you. And at the ending of that, he even dares to say, this was lofty. And it shows his arrogance, and it also shows his inability to see the distinction between something that is quality and something that is not quality. And the assumption is that Shakespeare is saying that his competition would write things like the raging rocks and shivering shocks, as opposed to something that's much more naturalistic. Take comfort, he no more shall see my face, Lysander and myself will fly this place. Before the time I did Lysander see, seemed Athens a paradise to me. And I believe we might have talked about this when we were talking about the chain of being earlier on, that ultimately poetry was oftentimes associated with the higher level orders on the chain of being, and that prose or complete sentences with the lower orders. But Shakespeare would oftentimes make political commentary through the use of language, and that we would have a higher order individual or being who would not speak poetry but speak prose in order to show dissent. Or we would see the opposite, where we would see a lower end being speak poetry, to illustrate that just because one is born in a particular position in the hierarchy, that doesn't necessarily mean that one can't move up or down through one's actions, not just through one's birthrights. Probably one of the most fun parts of the play are the insults that occur in Act 3. And if this were a tragedy, this Act 3 would have basically led to death. And then we would have had the loss of major characters. But we know that as a comedy, no one can be physically hurt. So the insults, as dark as they are, ultimately are going to have to be resolved in one way or another so that we can have our happy ending. But think about some of the language or some of the insults that are used in Act 3, Scene 2. For instance, line 258 in Act 3, Scene 2, line 258, where basically Lysander says to Hermia, away, you Ethiop. You know, and he's making reference to Ethiopia and the idea that she has dark features. Remember, he had once loved her, and now it looks like this love has turned to hate, to illustrate how quickly love can turn to hate, the thin line between the two. And then later on, Lysander says around line 270, although I hate her, I'll not harm her so. You know, his first thought, he says he hates her. His first thought is that perhaps he should hurt her. And then, of course, as we go on, Helena and Hermia have wonderful dialogue with one another. Hermia is basically accusing Helena of stealing her love. And Helena says, and this is around line 284 or so of Act 3, Scene 2, fine in faith, Helena says, have you no modesty, no maiden shame? No touch of bashfulness? What? Will you tear impatient answers from my gentle tongue? Fie, you counterfeit, you puppet, you. And puppet is an insult because puppet is something that is controlled by someone else. She's saying that that's what Hermia is. And also it's a reference to Hermia's short stature. I always call this scene the catfight scene. And Hermia's response is, puppet? Why, so, that way goes the game. Now I perceive that she may compare between our statures, that she urge her height, and with her personage, her tall personage. Her height, forsooth, she had prevailed with him. And are you grown so high in his esteem, because I am so dwarfish and so low? How low am I, thou painted maypole? The idea, again, is that a maypole is a phallic symbol. So basically, she's just called her former best friend a penis. Painted is in reference to cosmetics. In other words, this is false beauty. She's basically saying she's a strumpet. And also that she's tall and thin, much like a maypole. How low am I? I am not yet so low that my nails can reach into thine eyes. This is why I call it the catfight scene, because they're really ready to scratch each other's eyes out. And the insults go on, and Lysander, and remember that he once loved Hermia immensely, says, "Get you gone." This is around line 328 or so. "Get you gone, you dwarf, you minimus of hindering not grass made, you bead, you acorn." Again, these are all insults about her height, or I should say, her lack of height. So when Puck says, and this is in Act 3, and I believe it's also Scene 2, around line 115 or so, "What fools these mortals be." I mean, that's really a great commentary for what's going on within the play as a whole, is that they are all basically foolish. Love has made them all foolish. Now, those insults, as I indicated, might be the most fun part of the play, but Shakespeare, being a business person, understands too that if he can give a little bit of flattery to those individuals that are supporting him, either financially or politically or both, then that's always a good rule of thumb. And the fifth act is seen as a tribute in part to the Queen herself. And this is when in Act 5, Scene 1, line 93 or so, where the king and queen are speaking prior to the performance of Pyramus and Thisbe. And Theseus and Hippolyta are talking a little bit about how they respond when individuals try to honor them. And specifically, they're talking about what happens when individuals are so nervous, their subjects, that they don't give them the proper greeting and the proper honor. And what Theseus says is that he sees this as even a greater greeting than doing an appropriate greeting, because their nervousness shows and their anxiety shows that they truly do admire and honor the king and the queen. There's no falsehood associated with that. So this is again in Act 5, Scene 1, line 93, where Theseus says, "The kinder we to give them," basically flatterers or their subjects, "thanks for nothing. Our sport shall be to take what they mistake, and what poor duty cannot do, noble respect takes it in might, not merit. Where I've come, great clerks have proposed to greet me with premeditated welcomes. Where I've seen them shiver and look pale, make periods in the midst of sentences, throttle their practised accent in their fears, and in conclusion dumbly have broke off, not paying me a welcome. Trust me, sweet, out of this silence yet I picked a welcome. And in the modesty of fearful duty, I read as much from the rattling tongue of saucy and audacious eloquence. Love, therefore, and tongue-tied simplicity in least speak most to my capacity." The assumption is that this is in direct reference to Queen Elizabeth, saying that she also is gracious enough to respond the same way to her subjects when they don't give her a proper greeting. So we know that Shakespeare oftentimes used his sonnets as a vehicle to flatter individuals in power. So it wouldn't be surprising that he would take an opportunity to do something similar in his comedies if the situation presented itself. And as I suggested, Shakespeare's quite bawdy. There are references to sex throughout the play. At one point, Hermia and Lysander are running off in the wilderness, and Lysander wants to lie next to Hermia, and Hermia says, "Lie further off, thou rhymest prettily." The idea of that she doesn't want to be tempted if they're both alone in the dark, lying next to one another on midsummer nights, no less. And then there is also reference to Helena and Demetrius, where Demetrius says, if you continue to pursue me, I will ultimately do thee mischief in the woods. So basically what he's threatening to do to her is to rape her, is to take her virginity if she continues on by pursuing him and chasing him. And then we know how ultimately sexuality was used as a weapon by Queen Titania against Oberon when she is denied him his marriage bed. And ultimately, as they are arguing over the changeling child, she's denying him sexual relations. But there was one scene in particular that I wanted to draw your attention to at the very ending of the play. And this is in Act 5, Scene 1, line 188, that oftentimes is read as a direct sexual reference. And this happens to be during the performance of the play within a play, with Pyramus and Thisbe. And I can't necessarily take credit nor blame for this, but I did want to draw your attention to it. And this is where ultimately Thisbe says, and again, this is, I believe, in Act 5, Scene 1, line 188 or so. Thisbe says, O wall, full often hast thou heard my moans, for parting my fair Pyramus and me. My cherry lips have often kissed thy stones with lime and hair knit up in thee. And this is oftentimes seen as a reference to oral sex. My cherry lips have often kissed thy stones being testicles. Thy stones with lime and hair being pubic hair, knit up in thee. And this idea of, O wall, full often hast thou heard my moans, that this would be sexual moans of ecstasy. So I wanted to end with Puck's final speech, as I was referencing earlier, that I think is one of the more interesting parts of the play, because Puck can be seen as not only Puck the character apologizing to anyone who might have taken offense, and basically everyone should be taking offense on some level to one of the things that was mentioned in this particular play. As I had suggested, Shakespeare's equal opportunity, and he mocks us all, at least, himself included. This is also the actor apologizing if there was anybody in the audience who took offense to the actual production. And this is ultimately Shakespeare, the playwright, apologizing to us, again, if we took offense to his writing. And typical of Puck, it's not a straightforward apology, and maybe that's also typical of Shakespeare as well. His final speech in Act 5, Scene 1, line 423. If we shadows have offended, think but this, and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here, while these visions did appear. And this weak and idle theme, no more yielding, but a dream. Gentles, do not reprehend. If you pardon, we will mend. And, as I am an honest Puck, if we have unearned luck, now to scape the serpent's tongue, we will make amends ere long, else the Puck a liar call. So, good night unto you all. Give me your hands if we be friends, and Robin shall restore amends. And keep in mind that Puck is also known as Robin Goodfellow. And he says, if we shadows, and he's talking about the idea of them actors being shadows, that basically there is the sense of fantasy associated with acting. If we shadows have offended, but there also is that whole light-dark imagery that I was talking about, as well as doubling. There's a good amount of doubling in the play. Think but this, and everything is, or all is mended, that you have but slumbered here. Pretend that you were asleep. And while these visions did appear, and this weak and idle theme, no more yielding but a dream. Imagine that this was a dream. Remember, this is pretend. Don't take it too seriously. This is fiction. This is drama. This is play acting. Gentles mean gentlemen and gentlewomen. Do not reprehend. If you pardon, we will mend. And basically, if you're upset, just give me your pardon and then we will rectify the situation. And what I think is perhaps the most interesting line, and as I am an honest Puck, if we have unearned luck. But the thing is that Puck isn't completely honest. So already that's being undercut. And as I am an honest Puck, if we have unearned luck, now to escape the serpent's tongue, that would be the hissing that would go on by the audience if they didn't approve of what they saw. Now to escape the serpent's tongue, we will make amends ere long, else the Puck a liar call. And again, Puck is a liar. So you have to wonder how sincere this apology is. So good night unto you all. So this is basically his way of saying it's over now, the play. Give me your hands if we be friends. And basically he's asking for applause at this point. And Robin shall restore amends. So obviously there's quite a bit that you can talk about in terms of this play. For journal number 2, which is going to be due on the 3rd, which is on Wednesday, 11:59 p.m. via a PDF, that basically what I'm asking you to do is to devote due on the 28th, which happens to be Monday. At 11:59 p.m. That's when your Midsummer Night's Dream Journal is due, via PDF to my email. I'm asking you to respond in about a page or so, in terms of what you think might be some of the major themes or ideas in the drama, or certainly you can go beyond the page, but I was thinking that a page would give you a good snapshot. Obviously, you can write quite a bit about A Midsummer Night's Dream, an entire book if you so wanted. That gets us to talking about our first paper, where you might have liked to write about A Midsummer Night's Dream. And I'm looking at the time. I think that what might make sense is that I talk about that first paper and possible paper topics next class, though I have included the handouts in our syllabus and other documents folder, but I'll talk about those in depth next class, just so that I can end this video fairly soon. And I'm thinking paper number 1, that's what's going to be due on approximately the 30th of March, would be about 4 to 5 pages, but as long or as short as it needs to be. A critical paper, so that you aren't writing a research paper, though if you have your heart set on a research paper, we can negotiate. And as I said, I have some suggested paper topics that I put in our syllabus and other documents folder that I'll be talking about next class, as well as some of the conventions of writing a paper that hopefully these are elements that are review for you from previous English classes. But I've got a handout there that I posted that was actually given to me in my undergraduate days by my first, or I should say my perhaps best Shakespeare teacher, and that would be Russ McDonald, who was known as the God of Shakespeare in my college campus. So I wanted to review that because I still think it's one of the best that's out there. He may not have been my first Shakespeare teacher, but he certainly was the most influential Shakespeare teacher that I had, that I can definitely say. So that we can talk about those two things, writing papers and documentation, and also begin talking about Much Ado About Nothing. So for today's attendance question, and this will be due on Friday the 25th at 8 a.m., now that we've talked about the play, A Midsummer Night's Dream, what do you think is the most interesting thing about this particular play, A Midsummer Night's Dream? Or what do you think is one of the more interesting things about this play, A Midsummer Night's Dream? Again, you don't necessarily have to respond to your classmates' responses, but I do ask that you read them so that you can get a sense of the class discussion that we would have. So I hope you're all doing well. I'm doing well. We will continue on next class talking about writing papers and our next comedy, Much Ado About Nothing. Take care. Bye-bye.